September 15, 1940. Tokyo's prime minister's residence was thick with cigarette smoke, the haze curling around the high ceilings like a prelude to a storm. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who would one day command Japan's combined fleet, stubbed out his third American lucky strike, an ironic gesture few noticed. The room carried the weight of history yet to unfold. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe cut through the formalities of protocol with a blunt question. If we go to war with America, what are our chances? Yamamoto's answer was chilling in its precision and would haunt the Japanese Empire until its final day. If I am told to fight regardless of consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Around the table, senior military officials shifted uneasily. Here was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Japan's most capable strategist, essentially predicting his nation's defeat before the first shot was fired. Yet this was not idle speculation. Yamamoto had seen the machinery of America firsthand. He had walked its factories, traced the veins of its oil pipelines, studied production rates down to every rivet and rivulet of steel. He had calculated the country's industrial capacity like a mathematician plotting an inevitable equation of destruction. The Japanese leadership had no desire to confront the truth. The war was already lost, the only unknown being the span of time, 6 months of tactical victories before reality intervened. Born on April 4, 1884 in Nagawaka, a modest city in Niigata Prefecture, Yamamoto was the 6th son of a struggling schoolteacher. His father, 56 at the time of his birth, inspired his name, Isoroku, literally 56 in Japanese. Poverty marked his early years. Meals of sweet potatoes and barley were common, rice a luxury often out of reach. This humble upbringing would sharpen his understanding of scarcity, a lens through which he would later observe America's abundance with unblinking clarity. In 1916, the young naval officer was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a strategic move in the rigid societal hierarchy of Japan. By then, he had already lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, witnessing Japan's stunning victory over Russia's Baltic Fleet. This triumph had seduced many Japanese into believing that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage, a notion Yamamoto would spend a lifetime challenging. He understood, unlike many contemporaries, that Tsushima's success was contingent on Russia's logistical overreach and internal turmoil, factors America would never share. To truly grasp the full measure of American power, Yamamoto needed immersion. His opportunity came in 1919 at age 35, when he was sent to Harvard University ostensibly to study English and observe American naval developments. The man who would become Japan's Cassandra arrived in Cambridge with 2 swords and a naval uniform, instantly a figure of fascination among the ivy-covered halls. His grades in English were mediocre at best, yet his real education unfolded outside classrooms, nights spent poring over technical journals, statistical abstracts, maps, and industrial reports. His modest quarters in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, became a laboratory of obsession. He slept 3 to 4 hours nightly, dedicating the remainder to studying American manufacturing, petroleum production, and aviation. Harvard's Widener Library became a sanctuary where he meticulously cataloged data on the engines of a rising industrial colossus. Summer breaks were devoted to unauthorized expeditions across America, often hitchhiking with little money, living off bread and water, sleeping in barns and fields, all in pursuit of first-hand knowledge. His journey led him to Texas, where the oil fields of East Texas, the fountains of modern power, revealed a scale Japan could scarcely imagine. Single wells produced more oil in a day than Japan imported in a week. He spoke to roughnecks and engineers, sketched refineries, noted extraction rates, and the marvel of continuous electric pumps and lighting that powered operations 24 hours a day. In his journal, he wrote plainly, "Oil is the blood of modern warfare. America has oceans of it. Japan has none. This single fact determines everything. By 1920, Yamamoto stood outside the Ford Highland Park plant in Detroit, watching 20,000 workers stream from the factory. He observed assembly lines that turned raw steel into finished automobiles in under 100 minutes. One Model T rolled off every 45 seconds. He scribbled calculations. Ford alone employed more industrial workers than the entire Japanese Navy. Its daily steel consumption exceeded Japan's weekly output. The mass production he witnessed could easily pivot from civilian vehicles to military machinery, trucks, tanks, aircraft. Each observation cemented a stark, undeniable reality. In a prolonged conflict, Japan would be outmatched not by strategy or courage, but by the relentless arithmetic of industry. Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1921 with more than just notebooks and calculations. He brought a vision, and a warning few wanted to hear. He advocated for modernization of the Imperial Japanese Navy, emphasizing aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and strategic fuel reserves. "We cannot fight the United States as we fought Russia," he told his peers. "Our victories will be temporary if we do not innovate. Time is our enemy." Yet in a nation intoxicated by expansionist fervor, Yamamoto's warnings were often ignored or downplayed. The military elite, still basking in the glory of past victories, believed in the invincibility of the Japanese spirit. They saw America as politically fragmented, overconfident, and culturally decadent, a nation that could be subdued before it fully mobilized. Yamamoto knew better. America's might was not in nationalism or martial tradition, but in steel, oil, and unrelenting industrial production. By the 1930s, as Japan's imperial ambitions grew, Yamamoto rose steadily through the ranks, always observing, calculating, and planning. He pioneered carrier aviation tactics, recognizing that battleships, the pride of Japan's fleet, were increasingly vulnerable to air power. "The plane will decide the battle before ships can close," he noted. This foresight would later manifest in the precision strike at Pearl Harbor, a tactical masterpiece, though ultimately a strategic prelude to defeat. In 1939, as war erupted in Europe, Yamamoto's mind returned to his studies in America. He analyzed the United States' mobilization potential, predicting that a full-scale war would see production numbers so staggering they could eclipse any initial Japanese advantage. He became painfully aware that Japan's strategic calculus demanded speed, surprise, and temporary victories. A prolonged conflict meant inevitable loss. And yet, the die was cast. Nationalistic fervor, diplomatic miscalculations, and the lure of territorial conquest swept Japan toward confrontation. Yamamoto, now an admiral, accepted his role not as a skeptic, but as a soldier executing orders he knew were destined to end in disaster. His understanding of American power, the factories, the oil fields, the assembly lines, was both a curse and a guiding force. He sought to maximize Japan's initial successes, hoping that a decisive blow could force negotiations before industrial reality rendered resistance futile. By late 1941, Yamamoto had become the architect of Japan's boldest gambit, a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. He orchestrated a plan of surgical precision, leveraging speed, stealth, and the untested power of naval aviation. Every detail reflected his knowledge of American vulnerabilities, yet beneath the surface lay an awareness that this triumph could only buy time, not secure victory. He confided to a close aide, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." December 7th, 1941, dawned over Oahu with a deceptive calm. From the flight decks of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, waves of planes surged toward the unsuspecting harbor. The attack was devastating. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 American lives lost. Yet Yamamoto watched the operation knowing that despite this tactical brilliance, the strategic equation remained unchanged. America's industrial engine, its reservoirs of oil, steel, and manpower were undiminished. Japan had merely delayed the inevitable. Yamamoto's early insight into America's overwhelming industrial might had become prophecy. He had studied, walked, and measured every aspect of it, yet no preparation could fully reconcile national ambition with immutable reality. In his heart, he understood a paradox. The very victory he had engineered would propel Japan toward a war it could not sustain. The triumph at Pearl Harbor was a fleeting spark in the shadow of a mechanized, relentless force that Yamamoto had foreseen decades earlier. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's genius was on full display. He orchestrated a series of offensives across the Pacific, capturing Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines with a speed that stunned Allied forces. Each victory was a testament to his mastery of naval aviation and logistics, yet each also stretched Japan's resources ever thinner. Yamamoto understood the dangerous balance. Japan could strike quickly, but sustaining those gains against the industrial weight of the United States was a perilous gamble. Despite the successes, cracks began to show. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked a turning point. For the first time, aircraft engaged without the fleets ever sighting one another directly. Yamamoto's carriers were forced to retreat. The Allies had begun to learn his patterns, his tactics, his mind. He watched the battle unfold with a mixture of pride and frustration, pride in his doctrine being validated, frustration that the unpredictability of war was eroding Japan's advantage. Just weeks later came Midway, a battle that would define Yamamoto's legacy. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese communication, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Japanese plan before it was executed. Yamamoto, confident in his strategy, sailed forward with 4 carriers, unaware that the enemy was lying in wait. In the early hours of June 4, 1942, dive bombers struck. Within minutes, 3 of Yamamoto's carriers were ablaze, and the tide of the Pacific War shifted irreversibly. Yamamoto had anticipated risk, but not betrayal of this magnitude. His meticulous calculations could not account for the power of intelligence and the resilience of the American fleet. He was forced to withdraw, his dreams of swift, decisive victories dissolving. The loss at Midway was catastrophic, not just in ships and men, but in morale. Japan had tasted the limits of its reach, and the nightmare Yamamoto had foreseen, the grinding, unstoppable force of American production, loomed larger than ever. Even as defeat became increasingly inevitable, Yamamoto continued to fight with intellect and courage. He revised strategies, sought ways to conserve strength, and pushed for precision strikes to delay the inevitable. He became the face of a tragic pragmatism, a man who knew the ceiling of his nation's power and still pressed forward with duty and honor. Yet fate had a cruel twist in store. On April 18, 1943, American intelligence, acting on decrypted communications, pinpointed Yamamoto's flight path over Bougainville. Operation Vengeance was launched. His plane was intercepted and shot down, ending the life of the admiral who had so profoundly understood both his own nation's strengths and the overwhelming might of its adversary. Yamamoto's death sent shockwaves through Japan, but his foresight remained hauntingly prescient. He had predicted the rise of the sleeping giant, foreseen the consequences of overreach, and recognized that brilliant tactics could not substitute for industrial reality. The war would continue for 2 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Yamamoto had glimpsed the truth long before others did. Modern war was as much about factories as courage, as much about fuel and steel as honor and daring. His legacy is paradoxical, a tactician without equal, yet a strategist ensnared by the immovable laws of material power. He had commanded victories that inspired, yet he had foreseen defeat that no heroism could avert. In the end, Isoroku Yamamoto remains a figure both brilliant and tragic, a man who lived with the knowledge that genius alone could not overcome the inexorable march of history. After Yamamoto's death, the Imperial Japanese Navy struggled to maintain cohesion. Leadership changes were abrupt, often politically motivated, and strategic clarity suffered. The carriers that had once embodied Japan's naval might were slowly being outpaced by American industrial production. Every engagement, from the Solomon Islands to the Marianas, highlighted a growing imbalance. Japan's tactical brilliance could still win battles, but the war itself was slipping irreversibly from their grasp. Meanwhile, the Americans, buoyed by intelligent successes and relentless production, adapted and innovated. Aircraft carriers became the linchpin of naval warfare. Submarines struck supply lines with devastating effect, and the strategy of island hopping gradually cut Japan off from critical resources. Every Japanese advance became harder to sustain. Every loss compounded the pressure on an overstretched military. Yamamoto's earlier warnings echoed in the minds of Japan's military leaders. He had long advocated for caution, recognizing that Japan's victories were fragile and that the United States, once mobilized, would unleash a force far beyond imagination. Yet the military hierarchy, caught between pride and obligation, pressed forward. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, laid bare the consequences. Japanese aircraft were decimated, carriers were sunk, and the illusion of parity with the U.S. Navy shattered completely. On the home front, the Japanese population began to feel the strain. Cities were bombed from the sky, supply lines faltered, and resources became scarce. Yamamoto had warned that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's, yet his cautionary voice had died before the nation could fully heed it. The relentless grinding of modern war, a combination of firepower, production, and logistics, was proving his point with brutal clarity. Amidst this, stories of individual bravery persisted. Pilots, sailors, and soldiers fought with dedication, often against impossible odds. But heroism could not substitute for strategic imbalance. Yamamoto's vision of modern warfare, as a contest of both intellect and industrial might, was unfolding in real time, a tragic confirmation of his foresight. By late 1944, Japan's position had become desperate. The Allies' advance was relentless, the Pacific dotted with bases from which further attacks were launched, and Japanese forces increasingly isolated. Yamamoto's calculations had been eerily accurate. Japan could win battles, but not the war. The future he had foreseen, the slow but inexorable domination of American forces, was now manifesting with stark inevitability. Even in death, Yamamoto's influence lingered. Officers studied his tactics, historians debated his foresight, and militaries around the world would learn from his blend of daring, intellect, and realism. His life was a testament to both the heights of human strategic genius and the unyielding constraints of modern warfare. The story of Isoroku Yamamoto is more than a chronicle of battles. It is a meditation on foresight, risk, and the immutable logic of industrial power. His life reminds us that even the greatest minds must reckon with forces larger than themselves, and that the might of nations often transcends the brilliance of individuals. By early 1945, Japan was on the defensive across the Pacific. American forces, now equipped with overwhelming naval and air superiority, advanced steadily. The strategic island-hopping campaign brought them ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Okinawa became a grim foreshadowing of what was to come: ferocious resistance, kamikaze attacks, and staggering casualties on both sides. The war Yamamoto had foreseen as a contest of attrition was reaching its devastating climax. On the home front, the Japanese people endured relentless bombing campaigns. Cities like Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki would soon face destruction, the likes of which the world had never seen. Yamamoto's warnings about the limits of Japanese industrial and technological capacity now rang painfully true. Japan's resources, manpower, and infrastructure were being eroded faster than any recovery could occur. Yet even amidst impending defeat, the Japanese military held on to a sense of honor and duty. Pilots flew missions knowing the odds were against them. Sailors manned ships destined for destruction, and soldiers fortified positions they knew could not hold. Yamamoto's strategic mind had emphasized the importance of calculated risk, but the political and military leadership, driven by pride and ideology, often ignored his advice, turning war into sheer endurance rather than intelligent maneuver. Finally, in August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet declaration of war, forced Japan to surrender. The empire that had once dazzled the world with audacious victories was brought to its knees by the very modern forces Yamamoto had understood: overwhelming industrial capacity, technological innovation, and coordinated strategy. Yamamoto's death in 1943 had deprived Japan of one of its most astute strategists at a critical juncture. Historians have often speculated that if he had lived, he might have advocated for a more pragmatic approach, perhaps mitigating some of the catastrophe. His life and legacy became a study in contrasts: brilliance overshadowed by the inexorable march of industrialized warfare, daring tempered by the harsh realities of modern combat. Today, Isoroku Yamamoto is remembered not only as a military commander, but as a visionary who understood the future of war better than many of his contemporaries. His foresight, caution, and recognition of the strategic imbalance between nations provide lessons still studied in military academies worldwide. The tale of his life underscores a timeless truth: courage and intelligence can shape history, but only when aligned with the broader currents of power and resources. The irony of Yamamoto's career is as sharp as it is tragic. The man who had studied the United States in excruciating detail, who had walked its factories, counted its oil wells, and witnessed its industrial potential firsthand, was tasked with orchestrating a war he knew Japan could not win. Every tactical decision he made was shadowed by the knowledge that victory, beyond a fleeting initial success, was mathematically impossible. His meticulous observations in America had taught him the scale of industrial warfare. One aircraft produced every few minutes in Detroit, oil fields pumping in Texas, and California, shipyards capable of producing fleets faster than Japan could destroy them. All formed a lattice of overwhelming power. Yamamoto's understanding of this reality guided his planning. Strike first, strike hard, create shock and confusion, but understand that even a perfect attack could only delay the inevitable. Pearl Harbor exemplified this strategy. Yamamoto knew that American naval strength lay not in the port's battleships alone, but in the industrial and logistical machine lurking beyond. The attack was audacious, brilliantly executed, and tactically devastating. Yet, in his private assessments, Yamamoto had foreseen the strategic consequences. The failure to destroy the aircraft carriers, the fuel depots, and the repair facilities meant that America's capacity to recover was virtually untouched. Victory in a single battle could not win a war that America's factories were destined to wage. Even in the months following Pearl Harbor, as Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Yamamoto remained sober in his calculations. Singapore fell, the Philippines were occupied, and the Dutch East Indies were captured. Public celebrations filled the streets, but aboard his flagship, Yamamoto charted the enemy's production, the number of ships under construction, and the inexorable growth of Allied strength. For him, these victories were temporary reprieves, illusions masking the real war that America's industrial engine was already preparing to wage. By Midway, 6 months later, Yamamoto's prediction manifested with devastating clarity. The loss of 4 carriers, irreplaceable in the context of Japanese production limits, marked the turning point. The American industrial colossus he had observed decades earlier now exacted its toll. He had calculated the speed and scale at which American forces could replace losses, and the numbers proved him correct. From this moment, the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Yamamoto's final years commanding the combined fleet were a testament to his awareness of fate. His letters reveal a man haunted yet composed, a strategist who understood that the best service he could provide was to manage defeat with as much skill and honor as possible. He exposed himself to danger, visiting forward positions, observing battles personally, perhaps seeking an end he knew was inevitable. His death in April 1943, orchestrated by the very industrial prowess he had foreseen, closed the chapter on Japan's clearest-eyed strategist. Yet even in death, Yamamoto's warnings echoed. The subsequent months and years of the Pacific War unfolded exactly as he had predicted. Overwhelming American production, limitless fuel resources, and a relentless, technologically superior force converged to crush the Japanese Empire. His prophecy was vindicated by history, a stark reminder that foresight, unheeded, can only delay the inevitable. The legacy of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is complex, woven from strands of brilliance, tragedy, and moral ambiguity. He was a man caught between loyalty to his nation and an understanding of its limits, a strategist whose intellect foresaw outcomes his superiors ignored or denied. In studying Yamamoto, we glimpse the paradox of warfare itself. Genius constrained by circumstance, foresight powerless against political hubris, and courage tempered by the inevitability of loss. In the broader context of history, Yamamoto serves as both a cautionary tale and a study in strategic clarity. Modern military thinkers analyze his decisions, from the meticulous planning of Pearl Harbor to the calculated risks at Midway, seeking lessons not only in tactics, but in the perils of ignoring reality. His diaries, letters, and posthumous evaluations reveal a mind attuned to the hard mathematics of war, production numbers, logistics, and the flow of resources, factors often invisible to those consumed by ideology or nationalism. Beyond the statistics, Yamamoto's story carries a human dimension. He was a husband, a father, a man of culture and intellect, whose personal writings show humor, melancholy, and occasional despair. His ability to understand the enemy, to empathize with the soldiers on both sides, and to predict the trajectory of conflict underscores the often overlooked moral complexity in wartime leadership. War, for Yamamoto, was never an abstraction. It was a human endeavor, governed as much by numbers and machines as by the frailties and valor of those involved. The Pacific War, in hindsight, confirms the tragic accuracy of his foresight. Japan's initial victories could not withstand the tide of American industrial capacity. Each loss, each strategic misstep, followed the pattern Yamamoto had anticipated. Yet in every engagement, his imprint is visible. The precision of attacks, the daring maneuvers, and the relentless push to achieve tactical advantage even when strategic defeat was inevitable. Yamamoto's life and career remind us that knowledge and insight, no matter how profound, cannot always alter destiny when broader forces, political decisions, national ambition, and industrial power are arrayed against it. His story is a testament to the paradox of human foresight in the machinery of war. Understanding the future does not always grant the power to change it. In remembering Yamamoto, history preserves the image of a man who saw the shape of war more clearly than almost anyone, yet was powerless to prevent the unfolding of the tragedy he predicted. He embodies the intersection of intellect, duty, and inevitability, a figure whose life illuminates the costs of ignoring strategic reality and the weight of knowledge in the theater of human conflict. As the war progressed, Yamamoto's meticulous calculations of American capacity became starkly evident. The early months of 1942, the so-called 6 months of victories, were a fleeting illusion. Japan expanded rapidly, occupying territories across Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands. Yet every conquest strained their limited resources. Yamamoto observed the fragile equilibrium, knowing it could collapse the moment the United States fully mobilized. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the turning point Yamamoto had long foreseen. It was a battle of mathematical inevitability, not just of courage or strategy. Japanese intelligence underestimated the American carriers present, blinded by the assumption of surprise and by their own overconfidence. Yamamoto had advocated for caution, understanding that even minor miscalculations would have catastrophic consequences. When news arrived that all 4 of Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been sunk, he received it with a composed acknowledgement rather than shock. To him, this disaster was the logical unfolding of industrial and logistical realities he had documented years earlier. The human toll weighed heavily on him. Yamamoto was acutely aware that these losses meant trained pilots, sailors, and aircraft could never be replaced at a rate matching American production. He meticulously tracked shipyards, aircraft factories, and oil production data, noting with grim precision how the United States could recover and escalate. He likened Japan's position to children playing with stolen candy, while the adult, the industrial giant of America, prepared a calculated response. Yamamoto's internal conflict was profound. He commanded fleets with boldness and skill, but privately he wrote of despair and inevitability. His letters to Chiyo Kawai reveal a man striving to reconcile duty with foresight, attempting to minimize suffering while acknowledging the limits of what could be done. He exposed himself to danger during inspections, almost as if courting fate, perhaps believing that his own death might free him from the burden of commanding a doomed force. His staff observed his growing fatalism, noting his willingness to risk his life in ways that others deemed reckless, yet rooted in a clarity born of inevitability rather than bravado. Even as Japan attempted to consolidate its gains, Yamamoto's predictions came alive in the flow of American production. Reports of new carriers, ships, and aircraft arriving from U.S. shipyards confirmed his calculations. By late 1942 and into 1943, the industrial tide he had long warned of was overwhelming Japanese capabilities. Every factory, every assembly line he had studied at Harvard and during his Washington posting now worked against his nation, producing vessels, planes, and weapons at a scale Japan could never match. Through these months, Yamamoto embodied the tragic duality of war, the necessity to lead with tactical brilliance while knowing strategic defeat is inevitable. He was a living testament to the consequences of ignoring industrial power and strategic foresight, a commander whose intellect could not alter the inexorable flow of reality. In every operation, his fingerprints are visible, not in victory alone, but in the disciplined precision of Japan's temporary successes, a testament to his genius and the cruel irony of fate. By 1943, the shifting momentum of the Pacific War had become undeniable. Yamamoto watched from his command posts as American forces, fueled by an industrial output far beyond Japan's capacity, began reclaiming territory. The Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Aleutians became theaters of relentless attrition. He understood that Japan's victories were tactical, fleeting sparks in a strategic storm that was gathering against them. Despite these looming realities, Yamamoto continued to push forward with precision and professionalism. He coordinated operations like the defense of the Solomons with a meticulous eye for timing and logistics. He balanced aggression with caution, understanding that a single error could result in catastrophic loss. Reports from his subordinates often highlighted his attention to minute details: ship positioning, fuel consumption, pilot readiness, demonstrating a level of foresight rare among wartime commanders. Yet beneath the stoic exterior, Yamamoto grappled with the inevitability of failure. Diaries and letters from this period reveal a man haunted by the moral and strategic weight of command. He expressed concern over the lives of young pilots and sailors, understanding that the human cost of Japan's ambitions was mounting. Yamamoto's insight into American industrial strength made him acutely aware that Japan was fighting a war it could not ultimately win, a truth he silently carried as he directed fleets into battle. In April 1943, he began planning a series of bold operations intended to delay American advances and preserve Japanese morale. These strategies relied on calculated risks, leveraging Japan's remaining tactical advantages, experienced pilots, night combat techniques, and the mobility of its carrier fleets. Yamamoto's philosophy was clear. Even in the face of inevitable defeat, every action should be executed with skill, discipline, and honor. The juxtaposition of his brilliance and his awareness of Japan's strategic vulnerability defined the final years of his command. Every victory was bittersweet, every maneuver shadowed by the knowledge of the mounting industrial and numerical superiority of the Allies. His command became a study in the limits of intellect against inexorable reality, a reminder that foresight alone could not alter the trajectory of a nation at war with forces far larger than itself. By mid-1943, the Japanese high command grew increasingly divided. Some favored reckless offensives, hoping to turn the tide through bold action, while Yamamoto continued to advocate for prudence and strategic patience. His warnings were often dismissed, seen as overly cautious or defeatist, yet history would show that his assessments were chillingly accurate. In every meeting, every battle plan, and every inspection, Yamamoto maintained a meticulous record of what resources remained, what risks were present, and what the enemy could muster. His meticulous attention to detail, tempered by strategic foresight, left a lasting impression on both allies and adversaries. Even as the war's momentum shifted irreversibly, Yamamoto's leadership reflected a rare combination of tactical genius and sobering realism. A commander fully aware of his nation's limitations, yet committed to executing his duties with precision and honor. By late 1943, the realities of the war had become starkly apparent. Yamamoto's warnings about overextension and the futility of further offensive operations were increasingly ignored by the Japanese high command, who were under political and militaristic pressure to demonstrate victories. The cumulative strain of prolonged combat, resource shortages, and mounting casualties placed Japan on a precarious edge. Yamamoto's personal routine remained rigorous. He continued to visit frontline units, inspect airfields, and monitor naval deployments, often traveling great distances to ensure operational coordination. His presence inspired both awe and a quiet anxiety among his subordinates, who recognized that he bore the heavy burden of foresight. Pilots and sailors respected his skill, yet they were aware of the deep melancholy that often shadowed his calculated expressions. A man who understood both the brilliance and fragility of Japan's position. The commander's correspondence from this period reveals a striking clarity of thought. He wrote of the need to conserve skilled pilots, the importance of maintaining supply lines, and the inevitability of facing an enemy whose industrial might dwarfed Japan's. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Yamamoto viewed warfare as an equation of attrition and probability, not simply a test of courage or willpower. His strategies combined offensive maneuvers with defensive pragmatism, aiming to maximize effectiveness while minimizing irreversible losses. Despite his tactical acumen, Yamamoto faced an enemy who had begun to anticipate Japanese movements. Allied intelligence, code breaking, and improved coordination increasingly countered the effectiveness of Japan's operations. The Pacific Theater had become a chessboard where Yamamoto's pieces were diminishing, yet he continued to orchestrate them with precision, knowing that the margin for error was razor thin. In early 1944, Yamamoto began planning a major offensive to regain initiative and morale. He envisioned complex naval operations designed to strike decisive blows, protect supply chains, and exploit remaining weaknesses in Allied deployment. These plans demonstrated his enduring brilliance, yet they were shadowed by an acute understanding of Japan's declining capacity. Every tactical decision was informed by both opportunity and a sober acknowledgement of strategic reality. The juxtaposition of his strategic foresight and the political pressures of the Japanese command made Yamamoto's position increasingly isolated. He was a visionary constrained by the rigidity and ambitions of those around him. Yet, even as his warnings went unheeded, his focus never wavered. Every pilot trained, every ship deployed, and every maneuver executed under his guidance was done with meticulous care and respect for the lives under his command. Yamamoto's legacy, even in these final operational months, would be defined not by unrestrained aggression or blind heroics, but by the profound interplay of intelligence, responsibility, and an unflinching acknowledgement of reality, a commander fully aware that brilliance alone could not alter the inexorable tides of war. In April 1943, intelligence reports indicated that the Allies were preparing operations in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Yamamoto analyzed these reports with a meticulous eye, predicting that Allied forces would strike at key logistical points, aiming to sever Japanese supply lines and isolate garrisons. He cautioned the High Command that failure to anticipate these moves could lead to catastrophic losses, not just of territory, but of trained personnel and critical naval assets. He began devising countermeasures that were both bold and measured. Air raids were planned to disrupt enemy staging areas, while naval patrols were to shadow likely invasion routes. Yamamoto insisted on rigorous training exercises to ensure that pilots and sailors could respond to dynamic threats, emphasizing adaptability as much as raw firepower. This was a departure from the rigid doctrine that often dominated Japanese military thinking, highlighting his unique blend of strategic vision and operational pragmatism. Despite his careful planning, Yamamoto faced mounting frustration. His suggestions for defensive conservatism were repeatedly overruled by commanders eager for immediate offensive gains. He observed that Japan's leadership often valued symbolic victories over sustainable strategy, a tendency that would increasingly erode their ability to respond effectively to the Allies' coordinated campaigns. Privately, Yamamoto reflected on the growing disparity between Japan's capabilities and the enemy's industrial strength. In letters to close colleagues, he noted the impossibility of sustaining long-term operations without significant losses and expressed concern over the morale of both the armed forces and the civilian population. These writings reveal a man burdened not by ambition, but by the weight of unavoidable reality, a commander acutely aware that time was not on his side. In the field, Yamamoto remained a commanding presence. He personally inspected air bases and naval installations, often traveling through zones vulnerable to enemy attack. He was known to converse with junior officers and enlisted men, listening to their observations and concerns, demonstrating a rare combination of authority and empathy. Those who served under him remembered his ability to inspire confidence even in the face of imminent danger, though his eyes often betrayed a deep-seated awareness of the risks they all faced. Yamamoto's strategy increasingly relied on calculated risk-taking, aiming to leverage limited resources for maximum tactical effect. He understood that Japan could not win a prolonged attritional conflict against the United States, yet he sought opportunities to force local victories that could delay or complicate Allied operations. This approach underscored his strategic duality, a visionary leader navigating between idealistic boldness and the grim mathematics of war. The months ahead would test the accuracy of his predictions, the discipline of his forces, and the resilience of Japan itself. Even as the odds stacked against him, Yamamoto remained a figure of extraordinary clarity and determination, embodying the tension between human ingenuity and the inexorable pressures of global conflict. By mid-1943, the tide of the Pacific War was beginning to shift more visibly against Japan. The Battle of Guadalcanal had already drained Japanese resources and highlighted the growing dominance of Allied air and naval power. Yamamoto, ever vigilant, observed these developments with a mixture of concern and calculation. He understood that the traditional strategies of overwhelming offensive might were increasingly unsustainable, and that Japan needed to adapt quickly to survive. He continued to emphasize the integration of intelligence, logistics, and tactical flexibility. Japanese forces under his influence began conducting reconnaissance missions with greater frequency, attempting to predict Allied movements before they could strike decisively. Yamamoto also encouraged the use of night operations and surprise attacks, knowing that Japan's technological limitations could be offset by ingenuity and careful planning. Despite his efforts, internal conflict within the Japanese high command persisted. Many generals and admirals were still fixated on traditional doctrines that prioritized honor and aggressive action over pragmatism. Yamamoto's advice for restraint and calculated defense was often ignored or diluted, leaving him frustrated but undeterred. He believed that Japan's survival depended not on heroics, but on disciplined strategy and the efficient use of scarce resources. In private moments, Yamamoto reflected on the human cost of war. He wrote letters and kept notes expressing concern for the young pilots and sailors who were sent into combat with insufficient training or equipment. His writings reveal a man who was not detached from the suffering around him, but deeply aware of the moral and emotional weight of command. He knew that victory was measured not only in territory or ships, but in the lives preserved through careful decision-making. As the Allies prepared new offensives in the Central Pacific, Yamamoto redoubled his efforts to anticipate their moves. He coordinated air and naval units with precision, seeking to create a network of defenses that could slow the enemy's advance. His approach combined strategic foresight with tactical ingenuity, a reflection of his belief that leadership required both vision and adaptability. Yet even with his brilliance, the limitations of Japan's industrial capacity and the Allies' growing technological superiority posed challenges that were increasingly difficult to overcome. Yamamoto's awareness of these constraints made him one of the few Japanese leaders to realistically assess the long-term prospects of the war. In this period, Yamamoto's legacy as a commander was cemented, not only through his operational skill, but through the profound understanding of the interplay between strategy, human nature, and the harsh realities of global conflict. His story during 1943 stands as a testament to the complexity of leadership in wartime, a balance of courage, intellect, and moral reflection, exercised under the shadow of an inevitable, grueling confrontation with a determined and resource-rich enemy. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Japanese position in the Pacific had become increasingly precarious. The Allies, having learned from earlier setbacks, began executing coordinated island-hopping campaigns, bypassing heavily fortified positions and cutting Japanese supply lines. Yamamoto, observing these maneuvers, realized that Japan's defensive perimeter was vulnerable to both attrition and surprise attacks. Yamamoto intensified efforts to improve the coordination between air, sea, and ground forces. He placed particular emphasis on the protection of aircraft carriers, which had become the centerpiece of naval warfare. Japanese pilots were trained rigorously, though resource shortages increasingly limited the number of planes and fuel available for sorties. Despite these constraints, Yamamoto sought to maintain morale and operational efficiency, urging his commanders to anticipate the enemy rather than merely react. Intelligence and code-breaking became central to his strategic considerations. Yamamoto knew that understanding Allied movements could be decisive. He pushed for greater reconnaissance and for improved communication among scattered Japanese units, hoping to exploit any missteps by the Americans. However, Allied cryptographers were increasingly successful in intercepting and deciphering Japanese communications, a vulnerability that Yamamoto may have sensed but could not fully mitigate. Tragically, the very brilliance and foresight that defined Yamamoto also made him a target. Allied planners, aware of his leadership role and understanding the symbolic and operational blow his loss would represent, began to focus on him specifically. In April 1943, after careful intelligence gathering, the U.S. initiated a mission, later called Operation Vengeance, to locate and shoot down his aircraft during a transit over the Solomon Islands. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's plane was intercepted by American P-38 Lightning fighters. The mission was executed with precision, and Yamamoto, along with his staff, was killed. His death sent shockwaves through the Japanese military and populace. For the Allies, it was a strategic and symbolic victory, removing a brilliant and respected commander from Japan's war effort. Yamamoto's passing underscored the deadly intersection of intelligence, technology, and leadership in modern warfare. His life and career remain emblematic of the complexity of military command, a blend of vision, courage, and profound understanding of both human and strategic realities. While Japan continued the war under new leadership, the loss of Yamamoto marked a turning point, highlighting the fragility of even the most formidable strategic minds in the face of relentless, well-coordinated opposition.